You are about to follow a documentary series that will reveal the complete trajectory of Christianity, from a small group of persecuted people to becoming the most influential faith on the planet. In each episode, we will delve into a part of this fascinating story, full of challenges, discoveries, and transformations. Today, in the first chapter, you will learn about the origins of Christianity, the first disciples, and the context that shaped the early church. Get ready, because this is just the first part of a journey that will change the way you see the history of humanity.
History of Christianity. Chapter 1. The Church of the Apostles and Martyrs. Episode 1. Salvation comes from the Jews.
In the last years of the reign of Tiberius, that is, about the year 36 or 37 of our calendar, a rumor spread among the Jewish colonies scattered throughout the empire, which soon aroused the liveliest interest. All was calm in this Mediterranean world, which in 3 centuries Rome had refounded according to its principles. Everything in this immense empire gave an impression of order and stability. It is true that, having voluntarily retired to the rocks of Capri, where 12 luxurious country houses had been built exclusively for his pleasures, the now more than septuagenarian emperor spent what was left of his life given over to debauchery and the cruelest amusements, while the senatorial aristocracy, already fed up with vileness and denunciations, he looked anxiously at that island from which nothing but death sentences came to him. But the old misanthrope's bloody fantasies did not endanger the balance of the state. The capital remained calm, the provinces remained perfectly submissive, and both on land and sea commerce prospered wonderfully. Also in Palestine, the smallest of the regions of the empire, nothing exceptional seemed to be happening. Order reigned in Jerusalem, under the suspicious and sometimes brutal authority of the procurator Pontius Pilate. The Jewish community, having accepted the Roman tutelage voluntarily or by force, led, as it had been doing for 5 centuries, the same meticulous life of rites and observances in conformity with the rigid precepts of the Torah, under the watchful watch of the Sanhedrin.
Who then could have imagined that an obscure piece of news, contested as quickly as it had been known, and which the bird's wing carried to the 4 corners of the world, would violently shake that same world, and that, in less than 400 years, it would appear in the eyes of the whole empire as the revelation of the truth? This remarkable message came from a small group of Jews in Jerusalem. Whoever met them in the sacred courts or in the tortuous alleys of the holy city would notice nothing in them that distinguished them from the other faithful. Endowed with a living and exemplary faith, they were seen assiduously attending the temple, usually gathered under the portico of Solomon, or reciting every day the pious litanies of the 18 blessings at sunrise and at the 9th hour, keeping the Sabbath. We read in St. Matthew, "Pray that your flight may not take place in winter or on the Sabbath day." It is clear proof that at the time the Gospel was written, the Christian community observed strict Sabbath rest, and also all ritual prescriptions and fasting up to twice a week. While Jesus was alive, his disciples were reproached for not fasting, whereupon the Master answered, "Can the wedding companions fast while you are with them or spouse? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast." The early church maintained the custom of bi-weekly fasting, which had been introduced by the sect of the Pharisees, as can be seen from the Pharisees' monologue in the temple, in the famous parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, according to the ancestral custom of the Pharisees.
They did not belong to the ruling classes, to the chief priests, or to the elders of the people. Only a few prominent personalities, such as Nicodemus, maintained friendly relations with them. For the most part, they were humble people,
from the plebs, that is, ha'arez, those whom the learned scribes and the wealthy Sadducees looked upon with suspicion and contempt. Many of them were of Galilee origin, which was immediately noticeable by their accent, but they also came from other regions of Palestine, as well as from the most distant Jewish colonies in the lands of infidels, from Pontus, from Egypt, from Libya and Cappadocia. There were even Romans and Arabs among them, a curious amalgamation. It was common for them to meet separately to perform certain ceremonies which, although still Jewish in appearance, had a new meaning for them. Thus, for example, the meals taken in common, in the course of which the ancient rites were interpreted in a strange way. At the same time, a great harmony reigned between them. Initially, they had called themselves disciples because they had had a master, a founder. But afterwards, it seemed to them that another expression was more appropriate to designate the mysterious communion which sealed their mutual agreement. And from then on, they were called brothers. But they did not form a sect, like so many others that were known in Israel. They did not exhibit the outward austerity of the Pharisees, who constantly showed themselves with phylacteries on their foreheads, dressed in mourning, and with a conscientiously grave gait, nor did they spend their time arguing over the 1,001 precepts that regulated the Sabbath rest.
Nor did they flee from the world, like those groups of Essenes who, in the solitudes of the Dead Sea, had set up veritable conventual formations, multiplied their fasts, renounced their wives, and, dressed in white linen, became vegetarians. On the other hand, they had not constituted any independent synagogue, or Knesset, as the law authorized, as long as there were a minimum of 10 faithful. So had many Jewish nuclei from the distant colonies, who, with the exception of the collective ceremonies of the temple, liked to pray to God together with their compatriots. They were not people who sought to isolate themselves or seclude themselves. On the contrary, they were accessible to all, and their leaders incessantly invited pious souls to join their small group. If one wanted to fit these men into one of the established religious currents, the only one that would suit them in broad strokes would be that of the poor of Israel, the Anawim, who, scandalized by the luxury of the priestly caste and too illiterate to side with the Pharisees, reacted with humble zeal against everything that seemed evil to them in the chosen people, and that they had no other rule of life than that whose perfect formula had been given them by the Psalm. Blessed is he who fears Yahweh and follows in his footsteps. Psalm 128:1. It was thought that there was a kind of organized community that would have been called poor of Israel. But this thesis is no longer accepted today, and in the movement of the Anawim, one recognizes rather a general attitude of more traditional Judaism, a current of thought coming from the depths of the Jewish conscience, humble and totally faithful, which was expressed in many psalms of the Old Testament, as well as in non-canonical texts such as the Psalms of Solomon and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. What bond then united the faithful of this community, so ill-defined? What was this bond so strong that to hold this group together, it did not need any external barrier? And why were they gathered in Jerusalem, as if in this traditional stage of divine action, some event was about to take place whose secret only they possessed?
The answer was summed up in a brief sentence in which all the faith of those men was condensed. The Messiah has come among us. The world has allowed this formula to wear out, and it has lost its sense of mysterious revelation
and its revolutionary novelty. To appreciate the weight it possessed then, it would be necessary to go to the living roots of the Jewish tradition and to feel in the depths of being that fullness of love and that august terror that a faithful soul experienced at the simple evocation of this coming. The Messianic current had its origin in the heart of Israel's history. It had been initially linked to the national dogma of divine election, and it intertwined through the centuries with faith in the ancient promise made to the patriarch Abraham by Yahweh, and then reaffirmed many times, to Jacob in the dream of Bethel, to Moses in the smoldering Sinai, to the kings in the glory of their capital. Even when misfortune blew its wind of death over the chosen people, nothing could dry up this living water. On the contrary, more powerful, more precise, ancestral certainty had become hope and consolation. The great prophets had referred to it without ceasing. Isaiah, in an admirable chapter, the 11th, had recalled in detail the days when the root of Jesse would be like a standard unfurled over the peoples. Ezekiel had seen the dead rise and the future Jerusalem reborn from the ashes of the old. The book of Daniel, embracing the whole of history, had assigned to it the providential end, the installation of the kingdom of God on earth by the glorious restoration of Israel and the establishment of a people of saints. It was mainly after the return from exile that this grandiose image became individualized. The fulfillment of the old promise was to be carried out by God, of course, but not in a direct way. The Most High was to use a sacred intermediary to fulfill him, an anointed one, a Messiah, a Christ. This deep tendency that lies in the heart of every man to incarnate his dearest dreams into beings he can love coincided with the national dogma of divine election. Confused, contradictory, but singularly present in consciences, the image of a supernatural personage who would come to restore Israel to himself and carry out the work of Yahweh had been increasingly imposed. There can be no doubt that at the beginning of the first century of our era, the messianic stream irrigated all that was best in the Jewish consciousness. Temporal hopes in this period seemed definitively obsolete. The descendants of the Maccabees had sunk in blood, and the petty princes of Herod's lineage, as well as the officials of Rome, divided the promised land among themselves. But there was no Jew who thought of giving up to despair. On the contrary, it is enough to open the Gospels to immediately perceive the thrill of hope that ran through that holy race. When John the Baptist was preaching on the banks of the Jordan, the priests and the Levites came to ask him if he was the Messiah. Andrew, running to meet Simon, cries out to him, "We have found the Messiah." And the Samaritan woman, in her humble faith, confesses to her interlocutor at Jacob's well, "I know that the Messiah is about to come. When he comes, he will make known all things to us." It is true that in the various sectors of Jewish society, this image was interpreted in very different ways. Each one understood messianism according to his temperament and culture. A fanatical nationalist saw the Savior as a kind of Judas Maccabeus, merciless to his enemies. A Pharisee represented him as an eminently virtuous teacher, the living embodiment of the holy law. The humble people, always eager for the marvelous, surrounded him with the supernatural and illusory. Sometimes, taking advantage of the violence of this hope, adventurers arose who dragged their followers towards the immediate realization of this promise. Their names were Judas, Simon, Atronge. But all, one after another,
after a few weeks of agitation, were brought into order by the authority, without this fact, however, serving as a lesson to new suitors. A literary genre that was extremely widespread between the 2nd century before Christ and the 1st century of our era tirelessly explored this vein, the apocalyptic genre, whose starting point can be discovered in the biblical book of Daniel, and whose culmination is to be found in the Apocalypse of St. John. This literature was permeated with a strange poetry, crammed with semi-sublime, semi-absurd dissertations, in which the inflamed dream of an anguished nation mingled with the speculations of intellectuals skilled in the disciplines of mystery. The messianic hope, more concrete and more temporal, served as the basis for eschatological doctrines that sought to reveal the ultimate ends of man and the ultimate meaning of cosmic dramas.
These books, which the Church has excluded from the Old Testament canon, it should be noted, however, that the Book of Enoch was much venerated in the early Church until the 4th century, that it is quoted in the Epistle of St. Jude, and that the Ethiopian Church considers it canonical. They constitute a compact and strange whole, which had as its extension the Kabbalah and the Zohar. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Ascension of Moses, and, somewhat on the sidelines, the Psalms of Solomon, where the pious intention is most evident, as well as later the Apocalypse of Ezra. All these apocrypha certainly exerted a profound influence on the Jewish soul of the time. These are works that show the extent to which the coming of the Messiah was expected in Israel at that time as a fulminating revelation, which would be accompanied by sudden commotion. It was sung, "Blessed are those who live in the days of the Messiah, for they shall see the happiness of Israel and all the tribes gathered together." But it was also repeated by word of mouth that the coming of the anointment would be marked by atrocious signs. The wood will bleed, the stones will speak, and in many places in the world the abyss will open. The joy of expectation was therefore permeated with dread. It is this whole psychological whole, and composed of a simple faith, a living piety, a desire for revenge, a secret terror, the popular taste for the fantastic. In short, it is all this strange spiritual erectism that it would be necessary to try to grasp in order to grasp what the expectation of the Messiah could mean in an Israelite soul of the 30s AD, as well as the feelings of wonder and anguish that would overwhelm her when she was told that the time had come. Make the trumpet of feasts sound in Zion. Shout in Jerusalem the cry of the messenger of joy. Say that Yahweh, in His mercy, has visited Israel. Stand up, Jerusalem, your hearts on high. Look at your children from the sunrise and the sunset, gathered together by the Lord. Their joy in God also comes from the north, and their grouping from the most distant islands.
The mountains were leveled, the hills were faded, and the forests cast their shadow over the paths through which they were to pass. That they might be prepared for the feast of the Lord, the woods gave them all kinds of fragrant wood. Jerusalem, cover yourself with your garments of glory, cleanse your robe of sanctification, for God has promised happiness to your people in the present age and in the centuries after. May it come, may God's promise made aforetime to our fathers be fulfilled, and may Jerusalem be exalted forever by His holy name. Such was the prayer of the believing Jew, and the members of the community of brothers responded to these longings so intimately rooted that all these things had already been accomplished, and that the cry of the messenger of joy had already resounded through the hills. One of them, Simon, surnamed Peter, who behaved like his leader, speaking one day before a large audience, made these statements, which are even more difficult to admit.
Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man tried among us by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God has done through him among you, as you know. He was delivered up according to the purposes of the foreknowledge of God, and you crucified him and killed him by the hand of the wicked. God raised this Jesus up, and we are all witnesses of it. Let the house of Israel be made Lord and Christ whom you crucified.
Christianity started small, but it was already destined to change the world. In the next episode of our series, you'll discover how this faith left the streets of Jerusalem and began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, even in the midst of almost impossible persecutions and challenges. If you like this first chapter, leave the like, subscribe, and activate the bell so you don't miss the continuation of this story. And tell me here in the comments, what surprised you the most about the origin of Christianity? Your participation is essential in this journey. I'll see you in the next episode.